From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with woe? How can we make it better? How can we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as difficult as these questions are, some people are very confident about the answers to these questions. For example, morality is dictated by God in holy scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. For example, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. For example, our tribe must claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. In the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many of us are quite sure about what we don't believe, but what is it that we do believe? In my new book, Enlightenment Now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, namely the ones that were originated during the 18th century Enlightenment, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Now, many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they faded into the background as a kind of bland status quo or establishment. Other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment. So what are these ideals? I suggest that there are 4 of them: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the realization that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, why you're right, or other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you've appealed to reason. Now, humans on their own are not particularly reasonable. Cognitive scientists have shown that we are liable to generalize from anecdotes, to reason from stereotypes, that we seek evidence that confirms our beliefs while ignoring evidence that disconfirms them, and we're overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. However, people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms among them: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which brings me to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important theme of the Enlightenment is that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. Science provides not just technical know-how, but fundamental insights about the human condition. Naturalism. The laws of the universe have no goal or purpose related to human welfare, with the implication that if we want to improve that welfare, we have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Entropy. In a closed system, without input of energy, disorder increases. Things fall apart, stuff happens. And that's because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. Evolution. Humans are products of a competitive process which selects for reproductive success, not for well-being. As Immanuel Kant put it in different terms, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be built. Well, this leads to the third Enlightenment value, humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings. Well, enhancing human flourishing, who could be against that? It sounds quite obvious. But it's not at all obvious, and there are distinct alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, nation, race, class, or faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance a mystical force, dialectic struggle, or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because humans are endowed with a sense of sympathy, another recurring theme of the Enlightenment, that we have an ability to be concerned with the welfare of others. Unfortunately, by default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our genetic relatives, a few friends and allies, and cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through forces of cosmopolitanism, education, journalism, art, mobility, and even reason. As soon as I open up a discussion with you, I can't insist that my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. The very act of engaging in a conversation presupposes that our interests are symmetrical. Finally, we have progress, the expectation that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Well, you may ask, if human nature doesn't change, how is progress possible? And an answer from the Enlightenment is that it's possible through benign institutions, which allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to combat entropy, that magnify the better angels of our nature, like reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, and our thirst for dominance and vengeance. Examples of institutions that we owe to the Enlightenment include democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies, free press, and organizations like South by. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because I've discovered that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means that you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition and false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to the Voltaire character who declared, "All is for the best in the best of all possible worlds." Well, as it happens, Pangloss was a pessimist. A true optimist believes this is not the best of all possible worlds. There can be much better worlds than the one we have today. But these considerations are irrelevant because the question of whether progress has occurred is not a matter of whether you have a sunny disposition, or you see the glass as half full, or you see the world through rose-tinted glasses, but it's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit, that is progress. Well, let's take a look at the data. Beginning with life, the most precious resource. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years. But beginning with the Enlightenment, with the discovery of vaccination, sanitation, later antibiotics, and other advances in medicine and public health, life expectancy has increased so that today, the average across the world is 71 years. And virtually no one guesses that it's that high. As with many examples of human progress, the unfolding has not been even across the surface of the world. That Europe was the first region to escape from universal early death and poverty, and later the Americas. More recently, in the 20th century, Asia has almost caught up, and now we are seeing sub-Saharan Africa close the gap. For most of human history, the prime reason for reduced life expectancy was the death of children, the tragedy in which a large number of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Even in a country that today we associate as the most wealthy and advanced in the world, Sweden, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday in 1750. That has been brought down to 1/3 of 1%. That is a 100-fold decrease. And similar progress has been enjoyed in other regions of the world. Here are some countries that represent their continents: Canada in North America, South Korea in Asia, Chile in Latin America. And here we have Ethiopia in sub-Saharan Africa, which has brought its rate of child mortality down from 25% to 6%. Still way too high, but the progress is continuing. Health. The biggest killer in most of human history was infectious disease, a cause of death that is all but eliminated in the developed world. But even in the developing world, there has been fantastic progress made just in the last 20 years against the 5 biggest causes of the death of children in the developing world from infectious disease: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories per person to feed a population, taking into account age and activity. Beginning in England with the agricultural revolution in the late 18th century, that is techniques like crop rotation, more efficient planting and harvesting, later the invention of synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of agriculture, selective breeding of vigorous hybrids, and efficient transportation networks. Other regions have grown enough calories to feed their population. The United States, France, and more recently, China and India have made spectacular advances in their ability to feed themselves. Here you have the graph for the world as a whole. Now, this would be a dubious form of progress if all those calories were just making fat people fatter. But in fact, they have been reducing undernourishment quite dramatically at the low end of the scale. As recently as 1970, 35% of the people in the developing world were undernourished. That has been brought down to less than half that level. Again, the progress was highly uneven. Latin America was the first region in the developing world to decimate undernourishment. Here you have 3 regions in Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa recently has been making great progress. Of course, the biggest hit to human well-being from insufficient calories consists of famine, one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, which could devastate any continent for most of human history without warning. But famine deaths have been drastically reduced, and now famines occur only in the most remote and war-torn regions of the world. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was virtually no economic growth to speak of. This is a graph showing the gross world product from the year 1 to the year 2015. And it shows that the line is pretty close to flat until it takes off with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, thanks to advances in technology, particularly energy capture, but an educated populace, markets and finance, and most recently global trade, which have resulted in an increase in gross world product of about 200 times since the late 18th century. Again, the great escape from universal wretchedness was highly uneven, with England and the United States being the first to escape. But then in the 20th century, South Korea, formerly a dirt-poor country, has become highly affluent. And here we have Chile, and even China and India are starting to show exponential growth. In fact, the gross domestic product per person in India today is equivalent to that of Sweden in around 1920. Again, this would be a dubious example of progress if it simply made the 1% still richer. But in fact, the growth of worldwide prosperity has been decimating extreme poverty, defined as the bare minimum necessary to feed oneself and one's family. By that criterion, about 90% of the world was extremely poor 200 years ago, and that has fallen to less than 10%. In fact, there's been a 3/4 reduction in extreme poverty just in the last 30 years. And one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals is to eliminate extreme poverty everywhere on Earth by the 2030s. May we live to see that day. So Jesus may have been wrong when he said, "The poor you will always have with you." As a result of poor countries getting richer faster than rich countries getting richer, international inequality has turned a corner and is starting to decline. It had to increase with the Industrial Revolution as some regions became rich, leaving others behind. But now that trend has started to make a U-turn. Now, of course, within rich countries, inequality has increased, but it doesn't mean that rich countries have been more heedless of the needy. Quite the contrary. Until the 20th century, most rich countries spent no more than 1.5% of their GDP on the poor, on children, on the sick, on the elderly. But starting in the 20th century, every developed country embarked on a massive program of redistribution. So today, the median across OECD countries is that 22% of their GDP gets redistributed in social spending. Thanks to some of this social spending, poverty has decreased in the United States, although inequality has increased. If you measure poverty by disposable income, that is after taxes and transfers, then in 1960, by one measure, 32% of Americans were poor. That has fallen to 7%. And if you measure poverty in terms of consumption, that is what people can afford to buy, then poverty has decreased from 30% to 3%. Peace. For most of human history, war was the natural state of relations between states and empires, and peace was a mere interlude between wars. You can see this in a graph that shows the percentage of years that the great powers of the day, the 800-pound gorillas, fought each other in wars. What it shows is that 300 or 400 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Nowadays, they are never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China in 1953, 65 years ago, and there hasn't been one since. If we zoom in on the 20th century, there is no missing the two horrific spikes of bloodletting concentrated in the period of the two world wars. But World War III, which was widely predicted to happen during the years of the Cold War, never happened. And in fact, in the post-war era, not only was there no World War III, but the rate of death from all wars has declined. Thanks to the growth of prosperity, of democracy, of commercial ties between countries, of peacekeeping forces from the United Nations, and international laws and norms against conquest, and an increased valuation of human life that inhibits leaders from turning their young men into cannon fodder. The rate of death from all wars has fallen from about 20 per 100,000 per year to 1.2 per 100,000 per year. Freedom and rights. We have all been concerned by the retreat of democracy in regions like Russia, Hungary, Turkey, Venezuela. But still, that does not negate the fact that the overwhelming trend in world history is for democracy to increase. 200 years ago, the number of democracies could be counted on one hand, and about 1% of the world lived under democracy. Today, 2/3 of the world's countries are democratic, and about 2/3 of the world's population live in democracies. Those of us here who remember even the 1970s may recall that it was an era that had only 31 democracies in the entire world. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain, living under communist totalitarian regimes. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of a military junta. Most of Latin America was under the control of military governments, as were Indonesia, South Korea, and Taiwan. Today, all democracies, and the number of democracies is 103 today. And countries have been constrained in their ability to brutalize their citizens. Perhaps the most dramatic example consists of the death penalty, which used to be pretty much universal across countries, including for trivial misdemeanors like poaching and counterfeiting, often in grisly public torture executions. But in recent years, 3 countries have abolished the death penalty per year. And if the current trend continues, capital punishment will have vanished from the face of the earth by 2026. Violent crime. In pretty much any part of the world that is in a state of anarchy, that is not under the control of the rule of law, there are high rates of homicide and violent crime. In Europe in 1300, the rate of crime was of homicide, was about 35 per 100,000 per year. As the kingdom started to establish the rule of law over the medieval patchwork of fiefs, England, Netherlands, and Belgium, Italy all brought their rate of homicide down from 35 to 1. And that's a process that gets repeated whenever a government consolidates control over a frontier region and the code of vendetta and revenge gets replaced by third-party adjudication via the rule of law. It happened in colonial New England in the 18th century. It happened in the American Wild West. Fittingly, this graph shows Southwest US. And even in a country that has not brought its rate of homicide down to the level of the rest of the world, Mexico, 100 years ago, the homicide rate in Mexico was about 5 times higher than it was today. If we zoom in on the last 50 years, see that the United States did have a partial reversal of this trend when our rate of homicide kind of went crazy in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But even in the United States, we brought it down by more than half. And the world as a whole has reduced its rate of homicide by about 30% just in the 21st century. The rate of domestic violence, as violence against wives and girlfriends, has come down. The rate of rape and sexual assault has been reduced by 75% since the 1970s. Children are less likely to be picked on at school, less likely to be physically abused and sexually abused by caregivers. In fact, we become safer in almost every way, thanks to safety features on cars like seat belts and airbags, better designed highways, better enforcement of traffic laws. Your chance of getting killed in a car accident has fallen by 96% in the last century. We're 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to be burned to death, and in fact, fire departments are putting themselves out of business, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. But there is one trend that is going in the opposite direction, and that is the category that safety experts call poison by solid or liquid. And here you see the effects of the American opioid epidemic. At the same time, we're 95% less likely to be killed on the job. And even the so-called acts of God, droughts, floods, wildfires, storms, volcanoes, landslides, meteor strikes, earthquakes, all down by about 90% since records were first kept. And what about the quintessential act of God, the literal bolt from the blue? Well, yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. For most of human history, pretty much everyone was illiterate. Even in Europe, in the early modern period, no more than 15% of the population could read and write. Europe achieved universal literacy by the 20th century. Germany a little bit later, Italy still later. Here's the United States. And more recently, Latin America, such as Chile and Mexico, have closed the gap. And the world as a whole now has a literacy rate of 80%, 90% for people under the age of 25. Not just boys. In 1750, only 6 girls could read or write for every 10 boys. That was brought up to parity. And in fact, the world as a whole is very, very close to gender parity in literacy. Even the most backward regions like Pakistan and Afghanistan, the rate of female literacy has been increasing. So thank you, Malala. And in perhaps the most incredible example of progress at all, one that just defies belief, that just evokes incredulity, we have been getting smarter. In a well-documented, highly replicated phenomenon known as the Flynn Effect, IQ scores have increased by 3 points a decade throughout the 20th century, a gift of the spread of education and health, and the trickling down of symbols and abstract concepts from domains of expertise like science and technology into everyday life. Well, have any of these gains actually made our lives more pleasant and stimulating? And the answer is yes. For example, in the 150 years ago, a typical work week in the US and Europe was more than 60 hours. That has fallen to less than 40 hours, and workers get, on average, 3 weeks of paid vacation. Thanks to the penetration of running water and electricity into households, now 100%, and the spread of what used to be called labor-saving devices, such as washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of time that we lose to housework, which people rate as the least pleasant way of spending their time, has fallen from 60 hours a week to about 15 hours. That is 8 hours a day to 2 hours a day. When I say we, I really mean women, since housework typically is highly gendered. And it means that what used to take women 8 hours a day now takes 2 hours a day. Thanks to the decrease in the work week and the decrease in housework, we've enjoyed 8 hours a week more leisure time just since the 1960s. The gain has been enjoyed more by men than by women. It plateaued for women around 1995. And the reason is that nowadays women spend more time with their children. A single working mother today spends more hours with her children than a stay-at-home married mom in the 1950s. So forget Leave It to Beaver. We spent less of our paycheck on necessities, 60% a century ago, now less than 33%. Well, does any of this make us any happier? And the answer is, by and large, yes. In 85% of the countries for which we have data over the last 40 years, the population has been getting happier. And in general, as countries get richer, their citizens get happier. This graph shows that not only does the GDP of a country, as it increases, by the way, this is a logarithmic scale, so it really bends over, but people in richer countries are happier, and within each country, the richer people are happier, which means that as countries get richer over time, their citizens are bound to get happier. Has it come at the expense of the environment? And the answer is yes, although that has been dramatically changing, and the environment is now rebounding thanks to environmental regulation and technology that allows us to enjoy the benefits of industry without the costs to the environment. Since the EPA was formed in 1970, the American population has grown by 40%. Our GDP has more than doubled. We've driven twice as many miles, but the 5 major air pollutants have declined by 60%. So the idea that we can either enjoy modern economies or protect the environment, but not both, assumed both by people on the far right and on the far green left, turns out to be wrong. We can bend the curve. Deforestation in the temperate world has fallen to 0 as forests are no longer cut down for farms. In the tropical world, deforestation alarmingly continues, but it is past its peak, and the trend now is for less deforestation. Since 1970, the world has shipped twice as much oil by sea, but has had 85% fewer oil spills. And the amount of the Earth's surface that's protected against economic exploitation has doubled from 8% to 15%, and the number of marine conservation areas has also doubled from 6% to 12%. So I hope to have convinced you that by many, many measures, we have made progress. So how is the fact of human progress reflected in the news? Well, I'm going to show you the results of an algorithm called sentiment mapping, which tallies the number of positive words and the number of negative words in a big sample of news stories. And it shows since 1945, the New York Times has gotten glummer and glummer. And the same is true for a summary of the world's broadcasts, which just as we've been living longer, safer, healthier, and happier lives, the news has been getting more and more morose. So why do people deny progress? One answer comes from cognitive psychology. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman have noted that we tend to judge risk and probability by a mental shortcut they call availability. Namely, we rack our memories for available examples, for images, narratives, anecdotes. Now, if you combine that with the nature of the news is about stuff that happens, not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, here I am reporting live from a country that is at peace, or a city that has not had a terrorist attack. Also, news is about sudden events, not gradual changes. The newspapers could have run the story, 138,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline because it never happened on a particular Thursday in October. So if you combine the availability heuristic with the nature of the news, you get the impression that the world is getting more dangerous and always has been. Another psychological bias that we're subject to has been called the negativity bias, that bad is stronger than good. We dread losses more than we enjoy gains. We think about and feel bad events more than good ones, especially recent bad events. The passage of time makes us forget how awful things used to be, explaining the observation of Franklin Pierce Adams that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. This opens up a kind of marketplace for prophets to remind us of dangers that we may have overlooked. And so doomsayers, prophets, and will remind us of all the things that can go wrong. And we tend to accord them tremendous respect. As the financial writer Morgan Housel pointed out, pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Let me end with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment. You might think, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to speak truth to power, to rake the muck, to afflict the comfortable? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. That is, of course, we must be aware of suffering and danger where they occur, but we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because there are dangers to thoughtless pessimism. One of them is fatalism. Why throw money down a rat hole? Why throw good money after bad? Why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? If humanity is doomed anyway, well, let's enjoy ourselves while we can. Eat, drink, and marry, for tomorrow we die. It can also open the door to radicalism. If every part of modernity is in deepening crisis and is about to careen off the brink, then that licenses calls to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, or to empower demagogues who promise only I can fix it. Second question, is progress inevitable? And the answer is clearly no. Progress cannot mean that everything gets better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would be magic, and progress is not magic. Problem is using knowledge to solve problems, which is very different. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems which have to be solved in their turn. Also, the world has been and surely will continue to be blindsided by nasty surprises, and I've mentioned a number of them. The world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, the opioid epidemic. And there are severe global challenges which we have not yet solved. Foremost among them, climate change and nuclear weapons. But knowing that we have solved problems in the past, we can treat these as problems to be solved in the future. They're unsolved as yet, but solvable. They're not apocalypses in waiting. We can pursue decarbonization via carbon pricing and low, zero, and negative carbon technology, and denuclearization via international stability and arms reduction. And just a couple of indications that these are not utopian hopes, but are feasible, is that if you look at the amount of CO2 that it needs to be emitted to produce $1 of GDP, of economic value, you see that countries tend to follow an arc of increased carbon use followed by decarbonization. The UK increased its CO2 emissions during the Industrial Revolution when it started burning massive amounts of coal, but then climbed an energy ladder to lower and lower carbon energy sources, from coal to oil to natural gas to renewables and nuclear. It's a similar transition followed by the United States, by China, by India, and here you have the graph for the world as a whole. Now, this is by no means enough to deal with the threat of climate change. Those numbers have to be brought to zero, but the fact that they have been coming down shows that this is not a vain hope. Likewise, the primary fact about nuclear weapons is that throughout the nuclear age, no nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki, more than 70 years ago. And the world's nuclear arsenal has been in decline. That, in fact, it's 85% smaller than it was during the height of the Cold War. More generally, progress is not a mystical force that just carries us ever upward. It depends on embracing the ideals of the Enlightenment, namely applying reason and science to enhance human flourishing. If we continue to embrace these ideals, there is a reasonable expectation that progress can continue, and if we don't, it may not. Final question. Does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Is humanism, as some people claim, arid or tepid or flattened? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies are the happiest and healthiest places on Earth, probably in the history of our species, and they're the top destination for people who vote with their feet. Also, I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, even spiritual. Thank you very much. We'll have time for questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. And there will also be a book signing downstairs after this event. Yes, question?
Yes, thank you very much. You use the words for most of human history a number of times, but I guess you're really talking about the 10,000 years since the agricultural revolution. Any conjecture or thoughts of before that? We were, of course, a lot fewer of us, but the levels of violence and levels of cooperation and egalitarianism, I guess.
Yes, so I think there's been a lot of romanticization of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle in which our species spent most of its evolutionary history before the invention of agriculture. But my own view is that that has been tremendously distorted. For one thing, as I showed in a previous book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, most non-state societies, hunter-gatherer, hunter-horticultural, pastoralist, have sky-high rates of violence, of constant raiding and feuding. Even estimates that they spend only a few hours, that hunter-gatherer societies spend only a few hours a day gathering food or hunting, leaves out the amount of time they spend gathering firewood, preparing food, like hours every day smashing rock-hard nuts. And if you add up all of the hours spent both gathering and processing food, turns out they spend an awful lot of time at work. Life expectancy at birth in hunter-gatherer societies hovers around 30, even though there are many who make it to old age. There are many who die in childbirth. So it's not such a great lifestyle. The first agriculturalists, probably that was worse. But the way we live today, I would say, is much, much better than hunter-gatherers. And I say this having spent several days with hunter-gatherers in Africa. Perfectly nice and pleasant, but also really, really boring. I mean, the conversations that we have now, the vast range of art, of entertainment, our knowledge of the history of the world, of other places on Earth, our knowledge of science, all of these were unavailable. And so you have to decide, even if you're contemplating that kind of lifestyle, that just the kind of thoughts we can think are just unavailable in a small-scale illiterate society, and that's worth something too. So no, I would not trade places with life 10,000 years ago. Yeah, I suspect.
Hi, thank you for the shot of optimism. I was wondering how you would apply Enlightenment principles to the opiate epidemic, and looking at that as the one area where life expectancy is decreasing right now. So I'd be interested to hear that.
Yeah, that is an unsolved problem, and it's partly a problem of, it's one of these cases where solutions create new problems. I mean, painkillers are great, and many people, in fact, the majority of people who are prescribed opioids for chronic or episodic pain don't become addicted. This is an analysis by the psychiatrist and drug specialist Sally Satel. A lot of it comes from especially fentanyl and heroin on the street. That's the major cause of death. But more generally, the opioid epidemic is one of these paradoxes that when you give people more freedom, sometimes they use that freedom to do things that harm them. And that makes it a particularly difficult problem to solve, in some ways more difficult than infectious disease, where no one wants smallpox. No one does anything that actually acts to give themselves smallpox. And that makes smallpox an easier problem to solve than cases where people go out on the street and they buy fentanyl and they take it. So where will the progress come from? Presumably just from remedies that actually prevent the deaths, such as the wider spread availability of opioid antagonists, from greater awareness, both from doctors prescribing it and from restrictions on imports, and in the regions in which the opioid epidemic is concentrated, the demographic sectors, which is primarily middle-aged, less educated, rural white men. And these are also the parts of the country that have had the most economic disruption. Policies that try to address the economic disruption, which inevitably and always occurs, of greater unemployment benefits, opportunities for retraining, encouragements to relocate, that kind of cushion the blow of a modern economy, would partly alleviate the unhappiness that makes it more likely that people will try opioids. So no, as they say, silver bullet, but a number of things.
Hi, Stephen, and thank you for the presentation. A question I have is, if you look at optimism, a lot of studies are saying that optimism in the U.S. is at like an all-time low. I think it's I saw a study that says it's at like 16%. I guess against the world is like 13%. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about, and I think you talked about this a little bit, is like the gradual change that we see in the world is we're living longer and we're actually having less children. And one of the thoughts I had, and you mentioned entropy, like, do you believe as you get older, the brain does kind of go through a point of entropy where basically things start to degrade and you become more pessimistic? And with that, like, is there a code basically for enlightenment? Like you mentioned Kahneman and Tversky's work around things like availability heuristics and negative biases. Like, do you believe in the future we will be able to like code enlightenment so that we can understand some of the biases we have and kind of push ourselves to be more optimistic?
Yeah. So clearly, entropy does operate on the brain as it operates on everything. And indeed, the reason that that we do senesce and die and get more feeble is that we're made of violently thrashing molecules that are constantly degrading the apparatus that repairs the damage that occurs. And so as damage occurs to the damage repair apparatus, at some point we really do spiral downward. And even though I am highly optimistic that lifespans will continue to improve, I am very skeptical of singularity speculations where we're going to live forever and repair our body from the inside with nanorobots that course through our arteries. I actually don't think we're going to see that. So yes, entropy does affect the brain. That's why we're mortal. Whether it makes us more pessimistic is not completely clear, because even a brain that doesn't function as well is not necessarily a brain that's more pessimistic. It could be that it makes us more oblivious to danger and harm, for all we know. And I don't know. In general, happiness increases over the lifespan, sometimes with a dip in middle age, and sometimes with a decline in the kind of last inevitable slide toward death, the last few months, but not surprisingly. But in general, we get happier as we get older. So is there some way to counteract the negativity bias? I don't think it will come from any biological manipulation, but I think it has to come from in the realm of ideas. That the narrative of where we are, what problems we face, how to deal with them, has to, I think, be more statistically literate, more numerate. We've got to stop treating every bad event as the harbinger of a decline or an epidemic or a crisis, but put it into a statistical perspective. And therefore, understand in context that, for example, terrorism, which does terrorize people, a lot of people list it, Americans list it as the #1 problem, even though fewer people are killed by terrorists every year than people who die of stings from bees and wasps or who drown in bathtubs. So it's statistically a minor risk to life and limb, but in our psyches it looms large. That's what it's designed to do. That's why it's called terrorism. It's a terror-generating gimmick. So if the news were to calibrate events by their actual harm and put them in a bit of historical context, and by that I don't mean back to the framers of the Constitution. I mean just back a couple of decades, so people remember, hey, as bad as the economy is now, in the 1970s there was double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment, and people had to line up around the block to get gasoline. So don't be nostalgic for the golden age. It wasn't so golden. So I think that, and to be appreciative of, both in journalism and in education, of some of the institutions of modernity that I think people take for granted, like the rule of law, criminal justice system, democratic government, the United Nations, modern economies. They have problems, absolutely, but they're often much better than the alternatives, and we've got, I think, our collective understanding should acknowledge them. So it's by that kind of spread of ideas, rather than, say, some drug, that a realistic appreciation of progress has to be fostered.
Given all these trends that you've discussed, what do you see the impact on population growth and density?
So as countries get richer, their population growth rate declines, called the demographic transition, and it has happened to every country that has developed, so that in fact in Europe the population growth is below the replacement rate. In the world population as a whole is expected to peak in around 2070, maybe around 9 billion, depending on whether the effects of increasing education on lowered fertility continue. So the most likely scenario is that we'll peak around 2070, 9 billion, maybe 10 billion. As countries get richer, also better education, especially girls' education, reduces early marriage, makes women control their own fertility, and when women control their own fertility, they have fewer babies.
So I guess that means you don't think that there's any issue about whether the planet can support the peak in population or not?
Yeah, the planet can feed the population. Yeah, and I mean that's why in rich countries the big problem is obesity, not starvation. And there are many opportunities to feed the planet. I mean there are risks that we are not on course to solving, namely CO2 emissions, and an extra 2 billion people will make that challenge harder to meet. But the problem won't be hunger.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It was an absolute clinic on data-driven storytelling, so I really do appreciate that. So you've done a really good job about using the macro statistics to fit into your framework of what you define as progress. But it seems to me that, do you think that the battle of ideas, the battle of winning over people with Enlightenment principles will ever be able to overcome the material situation that people who are living in the system are suffering? Mm-hmm. Do you think what do Enlightenment principles do for the 13% of poor people in America, for example?
Yeah, well, the people who are pushing back against Enlightenment ideas, the kind of counter-Enlightenment represented, for example, by populist parties in Eastern Europe, in the United States, they're not primarily poor people. In the United States, the two bottom income quintiles voted for Clinton, a majority did, and it's far more cultural and racial fears than actual poverty that has led to the growth of populism. It's fear of terrorism, it's annoyance about immigration, and pushback against what people perceive as a growing political correctness. And it's more people's theory of where the country is going than their own personal situation that drives the support of populism. And in general, as I've said, the rate of poverty in the United States is decreasing, not increasing, at least when government transfers are taken into account and purchasing power. So it's, I think it's a struggle that has to be played out, not so much in the realm of economic improvement, although that, for other reasons, is important, but also it's a battle of ideas and values.
Okay. Follow-up question, if I can. So how has this talk been received if you've presented to any people who are in poverty?
Well, it's...
Have you?
I mean, I have, typically the people who come to bookstores and libraries are probably not the poorest segment of the population, although, I think there's an admission fee for South by, for example. As I said, it's not the poorest people who are the opponents of these ideas. It's the people with reactionary politics who are much more upset about affirmative action and terrorism and immigration than people who have been put out of work.
Okay. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Quick question. When you are talking about the forces that are shaping the world and talking about the key pillars of humanism, you mentioned mobility as one of these forces. Could you expand a bit further on your view on how mobility could make the world a better place?
Yeah, so the fact that we don't spend our lives within a 15-mile radius of where we're born, the fact that in the United States has been a country of immigrants, there's been tremendous mobility within Europe, thanks to the European Union, means it's that much harder to, say, for France to want to, or Germany to want to declare war on France. It means the fact that many of us live with people and work with people of other races means that it's harder to think that every African American or every Latino must be, as earlier generations thought, kind of lazy or stupid. All opinions that have all been in decline. The fact that many people know gay people who no longer stay in the closet means that tolerance toward homosexuality has vastly increased. Now, this doesn't happen under all circumstances of mobility. If there's a massive influx of immigration that don't assimilate and live exclusively in enclaves, that can lead to greater friction, as in parts of Europe where there are massive amounts of immigration from the Islamic world that have not been integrated into society. So so I wouldn't want to say that any time you have mixing of peoples, you get an increase in tolerance. But by and large, I think that's the average trend.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for that talk. The numbers you're showing are like absolutely phenomenal at the societal level, thinking about the progress and change that we've seen. But what are the type of changes that you're hoping to create at the individual level? That is, like the difference in decisions and actions that the average citizen can take as a result of knowing this information and insights.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and the answer is not obvious. And there has been a disengagement of people from institutions. The percentage of people who vote, for example, or who are active in many community organizations. Part of it, I think, is because of a massive cynicism about our institutions. Some of it may be even justified, given the very severe problems in American democracy, such as donations by the wealthy, such as gerrymandering, such as congressional gridlock and shutdowns. So there are problems in how democracy seems to be functioning, which leads to a kind of spiral of people disengaging from it all the more. So I do think there needs to be an effort to recognize the severe problems that we have and to try to fix them, particularly in governance, but to remind people that improvement is possible. We have enjoyed it. It depends, though, on them engaging and being committed to those kinds of improvement. So that is a change in the culture of reminding people things really can get better if we try to make them better. At the deeply personal level, like how depressed you get when you read the news or are aware of the world's problems, that is another challenge, another kind of challenge, which is that it's a little, I compare it to the challenge of that when you reach adulthood, anxiety increases, through the teens and 20s, partly because you leave childhood behind and you face all of the responsibilities of adulthood. And in some ways, we've done that as a society. If you go back to the 1950s, where happiness levels in the United States were a bit higher, anxiety levels lower. But on the other hand, they weren't anxious about things like racial segregation, the status of women, American interventions in other countries, like deposing leaders that we don't like, foreign policy blunders. They weren't as concerned about poverty. Nuclear weapons were kind of cute and proof of Yankee ingenuity. Then starting in the 60s, there was increased recognition of poverty, of American foreign policy blunders and crimes, of threat of nuclear annihilation. So people got, as they assumed these anxieties as part of their own personal worry load, I think anxiety did increase somewhat, and the challenge that we face individually is how to be responsible citizens while not worrying ourselves to death. And I don't know if the solution is to be found in mindfulness, meditation, or pharmaceuticals, or accepting advice from wise people on how to lead a balanced life. It's a personal challenge with cognitive behavior therapy. So there may be a cocktail of different remedies that have to be tailored to the individual and that we have to adopt more widely.
So just to follow up on that real quick, so I'm actually a data scientist primarily working in the mindfulness and mental health
So you're a
space.
neuroscientist?
I'm a data scientist primarily.
Oh, data scientist, yeah.
Data scientist primarily working in the mindfulness and mental health space. And one of the main challenges I often face with the insights and findings that I'm making in analyses is, how do we not just inform people, but actually make those actionable recommendations that actually will
empower
change
them, yeah.
the decisions and actions that people take, right? And so I just to kind of zoom in a little bit more on that answer, for like people who are listening here in this room or anyone individual who hears this information, like what is the one or few actions that you think people can take and actually they have power to actually do today with this information, and not just change their attitude in a way that may or may not result in anything different in the world, right? Because I mean, it's nice, it's all fancy and nice to show graphs, and I've done many analyses myself that are as impressive as can be in terms of visual representation, but it's like, does anyone actually do anything differently, right? Yeah. And so to beat that down a little bit more, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big challenge, and it does require, I think, it's not just a matter of the graphs and the data, but also the overall narrative, namely a narrative that progress is possible but not inevitable has to be, I think, more of part of our collective understanding. That would be a very short and not adequate answer to your question, which is a huge challenge. That people should feel that they're empowered at the individual level of health, for example, not be fatalistic, which is there are a lot of people who are still subject to the fallacy that well, it doesn't matter whether I smoke or not. I figure that when your number's up, your number's up. When you're going to die, you're going to die. And my great-grandmother smoked a pack a day and lived until she was 90. All of these kind of innumerate, statistically illiterate beliefs that people have to be talked out of in order to take the proactive steps that genuinely will improve their lives. So that kind of awareness has to be more broadly shared.
Thank you.
Hi. Great presentation. Thank you for that. My question is super simple. What is the one book you think we should read in 2018?
What is the one?
One book we should read.
One book we should read?
Yeah. I know you're a writer, but...
After Enlightenment Now?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, for people who are interested in the concept of progress and knowledge and enlightenment and are up for some kind of really deep, profound reflections, meditations, analysis on why this should even be a possibility for our species. David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity, is, I found quite mind-expanding. I mean, he's a brilliant physicist at Oxford and tells a story that is very much compatible with mine, but at even at one level, greater abstraction. What is it about the nature of explanation, the nature of science, that has made progress possible since the Enlightenment? He has no graphs, no data. It's all an analysis, but it's a book that I highly recommend. For just enjoyment and entertainment, I would recommend, just to keep it close to the family, Rebecca Goldstein's novel, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction, which Full disclosure, I'm married to her, so I'm naturally going to recommend it, but it is, in my mind, a tremendously stimulating and entertaining book.
Thank you.
Do you worry about decreasing trust in an objective press in the US, in presumably the UK, Italy, France, Western Europe generally? Do you worry that that foreshadows a shift back towards autocracy in any way?
I do worry, yeah, that we've kind of been blindsided by the effects from, on the one hand, social media, on the other hand, a polarized traditional media landscape with highly ideological sources like Fox News and Breitbart into a fissioning of realities. And I think it could, it has empowered the rise of populism in Eastern Europe and the United States. So yeah, I am concerned about it. What we do to, and I think there's now at least a realization that this is a thing, a problem, and there are countermeasures being taken in social media. There is at least a germ of an awareness that filter bubbles, polarized networks are at least a problem, a concern that wasn't even really an issue on the horizon that was mentioned until recently. Now, I don't know if awareness of it as a problem will lead to solutions, but it's at least the first step. Thank you very much. Book signing downstairs. Thank you.